join in, and we can just chat to the for the next 4 minutes as people come in, and then we'll start the multicast. But Scott, so right now, I mean, where are you broadcasting from?
Okay, I'm from my guest room / office at my home in Nyack, New York, which is about 20 miles north of New York City.
Oh, wow. And what's the environment there? I heard that there was a little dusting of snow, and
Yeah, we got about 4 inches or so, 5 inches the other day, which is the first snow we got all year, which is like the longest we've ever gone in a winter. So I was kind of thinking we might just miss it all together. But kind of aside from having to shovel a little bit, I was glad to have it. So anyway, you can see in my guest room here, this is a picture of when my son was little. I was at Disney with Chip and Dale. This is the rabbit from the Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So
the vicious rabbit.
Right. Yes. Yeah, the sharp point. Yeah. So little knickknacks and stuff here too.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to take my kids to Disneyland, but the different, that's going to happen, I think, this week, end of this week. But the thing is my kids are all grown now. And
Okay.
so when I was in when I lived in California, I was out of San Francisco, and we would go down to Disneyland when they're little, quite often, and take trips down there. And so this is kind of like our last hurrah. And
yeah. Well, the last time we went, my son was, he's a high school senior now. He was probably a sophomore at the time. And that's when all the Star Wars stuff was new. Yeah. So that's why we went to go see the new stuff. And so we're kind of a Disney, we've been a Disney family. So I think, they do a good job marketing. You can go there, it doesn't have to be a kid-centric vacation
right. Yeah, I had and this is a topic for a different day, but one of our colleagues that we work with used to work at Disney, and she was telling us about how structured they are, especially around the customer experience.
Yeah.
Even if it's not your job and you go into the park, you're on stage, right? You need to do certain things to enhance the customer experience. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. Lots to learn there.
Yeah, Sam, actually at the for the Association for Training Development, the global conferences, they always have Disney's training group is always there, and their seminars are always amazing. And I always think it'd be fun sometime to go to their Disney Institute and learn, because they've got, but even just little tips that I picked up from the seminars were always so useful. That was really good, really great.
Yeah, interesting.
They have a different approach, which is really nice. It's refreshing.
Right. Well, there was a couple of years, it was a long time ago now. I was at a World at Work conference, and we were talking about Disney was talking there, doing a presentation, and then they realized from a cultural perspective, the most important thing is that they realize that, hey, everybody that works here is a consumer, is a client of ours as well. And so the biggest thing was to ensure that they had internal alignment between the experience of their employees and the experience of their end users, or their customers overall, because they're often one and the same. So that was interesting learning I got from that.
That seems so simple.
Yeah.
That you'd want to treat your employees as good or better than you treat your clients, but
it's not just that, but
we miss that sometimes,
Well, it's kind of funny because listen, every organization falls short of these ideals sometimes. My wife is a theater actor and director, and the only job she ever got fired from was performing at a Disney park, and it was a really bad experience. Yeah. So anyway, that was many years ago, but I always hold on to that in the back of my mind.
Well, I would definitely say if I was working at Disney World, I would not want to work in It's a Small World After All.
Right. Oh my God.
Because they play that song over and over again.
Oh, I know.
And when I took my children there, my kids were they were like, we can't take it anymore.
I know, we had to
elaborate that over and over and over again.
Imagine your little boat getting stuck there.
Oh, And imagine just being an employee, like listening to that all day long.
All right, well, it is the top of the hour, so we do need to kick things off here. So I am going to, I'm sharing my screen. And so Jules, it's all you.
All right, we're ready to go. All right, welcome everyone to the People Strategy Forum. My name is Jules. We are so excited to have you here, whether you are coming on for the very first time or the 50th time, maybe the 100th time. We love when you can jump on live. That's always great. But you know, we are also in a podcast form now. So if you can't watch the live Zoom calls, that's fine. You can always tune into the podcast, or if you're coming to us from another platform, welcome as well. So we actually have a fun topic today. We are talking about the whole person workplace with Scott Behson. I'll introduce him in just a moment. Now, here at the People Strategy Forum, again, if this is your very first time, you have no idea what goes on, we are really here to engage and energize and elevate your employees and company. So we do that by coming together with a panel of expert hosts. They have experience in so many different topics, including talent management, compensation, human resources, strategies, and more. And we also bring on a different guest speaker every week. So we change it up all the time. You're sure to get some value each and every week. So I definitely encourage to come back and see us again, hop on every week to get the most out of it. So I did say we have a panel of expert hosts. I wasn't lying. Here they are. You can, if you are on our Zoom call, you can see their lovely faces. But let me introduce you to everyone. We have Shah, who is a former HR professional. She is an entrepreneur now. She's co-founded many businesses and is working on a new business right now, which will assist seniors, which is very exciting. She's also a career coach and consultant as well. We also have Sumit, who he actually logs in from India, so we're very global. He is a people strategist and consultant. He has helped and continues to help many different companies of various sizes restructure their HR processes and transforms them in many different areas, including strategy and DEI as well. We also have Howard, who is part of the comp team crew. He is a compensation expert and advisor who has helped many companies restructure their compensation departments and make them run more efficiently. We also have Wendy, another part of the comp team crew. She is a people strategist, talent management expert, and communications expert as well. And lastly, we have Sam, who brings us all together through the People Strategy Forum, but he is also the founder and CEO of Comp Team. So he knows all about compensation, talent management initiatives, and he's a global certified compensation expert as well. So that is our panel. Again, if you have any questions or feedback throughout today, leave them in the chat for us. And Sam, I think we've got it open to everyone. Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. Now that brings me to our guest speaker today. We have Scott Behson. He is a management professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University. He has written 3 books, and most recently his new book, The Whole Person Workplace, which is why that is also the topic of today's webinar. And he's also a speaker and consultant. So we're very excited to welcome Scott. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. And we're excited to learn so much from you.
I'm really happy to be here. So yeah, let's get going.
Great. Well, Scott, so just to kick things off, I'd just love to hear a little bit about you, a little bit how you got into the not just the teaching profession, but what drove you to write the whole person workplace and so forth. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I've I started really studying things like workplace flexibility and work-life considerations back in my doctoral student days in the very late 90s. And so it's been something I've been really kind of invested in for a long time, even before it was like cool and what everybody does now, right? And so, you know, I've been a management professor for a long time, and I teach things like human resource management and organization behavior. But like after getting tenure, you know, I've done all the traditional research and all the check marks you're supposed to do in an academic career. And after, you know, getting tenure and getting promoted to full professor even, I had what I called a mid-career crisis. And I was really just like, you know, what am I, like, aside from teaching, which I still love and really energized me, I started losing interest in writing, very academic, jargony stuff that maybe only another 75 professors who also study the same things would actually read, and it takes like a year and a half for these things to get published, and the whole way, and it was just frustrating. So I'm like, what do I really want to do here? And so I decided what I really want to do is have impact on, helping with work-life considerations. And so I started this actually back in 2012. I started a blog. So I was like, well, who needs good information on this? Working parents and employers. So I started with the working parents part. And in 2012, I started a blog called Fathers, Work, and Family, designed to just give advice and encouragement kind of based on like best practices and research and my perspective, both as a dad and as a management professor, on how dads can, advice and encouragement for dads trying to balance work and family. It was a gap that, it was a real gap in what we were talking about. And so it actually wound up becoming pretty successful pretty quickly. And that led to my first book project, which was the Working Dad Survival Guide, which came out in 2015. And then that opened a lot of doors for me to do lots of other things. And then I shifted my attention a few years back to the employer side. What do employers need to know to help people with their work-life considerations? So that's the work that eventually became the Whole Person Workplace. And my other work around that area, including Flex Friendly certification, which you might have seen on the screen there, which is a venture I'm involved in now. But it was interesting too. So I got my book contract in very late, very late 2019. And I started just prepping the book and everything through the early months of 2020. And I lined up all my interviews with chief human resources officers and CEOs and small business owners and other experts for like March, April, May of 2020. And the book was going to be pretty narrowly focused on work family stuff, things like parental leave and, let people work from home every now and then when they need to, and, stuff like that. And then, of course, March 2020 happens, and so I kept all my interviews. They were nice enough to do this, but back when the world was, peak uncertainty. But I talked to all these leaders at a time where they were really trying to navigate and think through, like, how do I keep my business, like, in business, and how do I take care of my people during this time? And it just became clear over the interviews that the two challenges were kind of the same. Taking care of my people through this crisis was how I keep my business going and thriving through this emergency situation. And, so a lot of this thinking right then is reflected in this book. So it's really kind of, a book became kind of the moment a little bit. And actually the title, The Whole Person Workplace, actually came out of some of the interviews that I did. In fact, one person I interviewed, she gave, it turns out this was the quote, but she said, we have to realize we get the whole person through the door. We get their backs and their hands and their minds and their hearts. And they're at all different stages in their lives, and we have to do what we can. And I think that's just so beautifully said, because it really gets to the value. I guess your next question will be kind of what is the whole person workplace, but it gets to the values of that, which is we look at an employee not just as a part of the machine or just as an employee. If we really value employees as more than that, as a whole person with lives and priorities and challenges and stressors and anxieties outside of work, we can, as an employer, and I think we should, think about employees that way and see what we can do to support employees in a larger context than we're used to thinking about it.
So the whole person workplace, I mean, is the concept is not new. We were talking about this a long time ago, before the pandemic and so forth. But how do you think this was? Do you think this was accelerated because of what we went through?
Yeah, no, entirely. And ironically, the fact that people weren't working in the workplace as much, and people were on like screens like we are today, like you could see that I have family pictures here, and I have little knickknacks, and sometimes my cat walks through, and sometimes my son comes home from school, and he's in the background, and we got to see each other's lives a little bit, right? And it's kind of being forced to work from home even when it wasn't convenient during the first year and a half of the pandemic. we really got to see a lot of these other life stressors, and you think about, luckily my son was in high school, but people with young kids who were dealing with online school for young kids and working from home, maybe in a smaller apartment, maybe sitting at the same dining room table. I think we all became more empathetic, I think, to some of the work-life challenges that we all face, leadership and employees. And then secondly, listen, the last 3 years have been an absolute ringer emotionally for so many people, and levels of depression and anxiety and stress and burnout. And you think about some professions like in healthcare and in other areas, the amount of overwork and stress and burnout and anxiety really has led to a crisis, right? That many people are not really themselves. We've all dealt with anxiety and loss for a really long time. I work with, an age group, who were like 19 or 20, who like didn't go to prom because they didn't have a prom and they didn't have a graduation ceremony. And, they lost all these things. And I think people still have those scars, and they bring it with them. So that's a long way to saying that smart organizations recognize that these stressors and these, anxieties and these experiences and loss, are things that an employer should try to help address if you can, because one, it helps take care of your people and we should care about our people. And then secondly, it builds a culture of mutual care where if the employer is stepping up for employees will step up for each other and they'll step up for you. So, it's both the right thing to do and I think good business to be doing this. And in my observation of, in all my interviews and everything for the book, the companies that already had some of this in place were 10 steps ahead when the pandemic came, because their teams already knew how to communicate and cared about each other. So even though they had to go distributed, they were still able to make it work, and they were somewhat dedicated to make it work and wanted the company to keep going, so they pitched in. Organizations where work was just a transaction of time for money, they lost a lot of people, and people just did the minimum, and people weren't felt like they were being taken care of, and they weren't receiving some of the support they needed. So that's kind of the whole person workplace approach. Is we should value employees in a certain way, and if we do that, then we think about how do we manage employees and what kinds of benefits and other things do we offer employees that can maybe help them with not just their work challenges, but also kind of their life challenges.
Yeah, so I would love to just to reflect back, is that we were talking about how this has changed and how far we've come over the past 5 years, 4 or 5 years or so. I just remember at the several years ago when we started this remote work and we were all confined to our homes as our new office, and seeing some of the shock that would happen on like for instance, what comes to mind is the I think it was a newscaster where one of his children came into the office during a broadcast, and I think this was on the BBC or something, I believe.
Oh,
and
yeah.
yeah, and he was just shocked and horrified. He's like, "Oh my gosh, what do I do?" And and then there was a couple of cases of this happening. Some of them just completely ignored it, like it would go away, or maybe somebody didn't notice.
Yep. Yeah.
And then others that.
I remember that very distinctly, and actually, because I was in kind of this work life area and had been able to do some media and things like that, I actually, I think it was NBC News had me on to comment about that incident with that professor who had a remote hit for CNN, I think it was, and his baby comes in, and then his wife comes in to get the baby out and things like that, and and that was like remarkable. Oh my God, how could this happen? And now it's like that's just normal, right?
Yeah, that's right. I know Sumit often has a friendly invader that comes onto his screen. And what I love about Sumit is that he's an animal lover, and so everybody loves animals and so forth. But Sumit, where's your friends? So Sumit, we lost your audio, I think, unfortunately. But anyway, it's always great. I think I feel like those interruptions today are, are things that just bring that little bit of sweetness to the experience.
My students during like COVID teaching online loved it when my cats came by, like absolutely positively. And in fact, I kind of encouraged it because it did break things up a little bit and people smiled. And we had a snow day here in New York yesterday. And actually my university went remote. Like we could still teach during snow days. So I taught a Zoom class for the first time since like 2021. And, my cat kind of walked by a bit. Like I think Samit, I think we saw an animal walk by a little earlier in the conversation. So and again, my students were like, "Oh my god," and it's like, it's nice. We to break things up a little bit.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry, Sumit, go ahead.
So saying I just keep a bag of treats handy when I don't have an answer to a client question. I just dangle it somewhere around. So gives me a couple of minutes to regroup and be ready while they're distracted.
My question is not as fun as this conversation. But Scott, what you said is that the first thing that has to happen is that employers have to value their employees. And I think for me, that was the hook. And like, how do we do that? I mean, that seems so natural, but in a smaller organization seems easier, but especially these bigger organizations. And so anyways, I would just love for you to talk a little bit more about that first step and how to help our people who are listening think about that for their organization.
Sure. Well, I think first off, employers large and small should really think about what are our core values when it comes to employees, and articulate those. And then these need to be sincerely held. I mean, we all see like we want to be employer of choice and blah blah blah, right? And a lot of companies talk the talk, but they don't really like do the work behind it. So again, it's kind of interesting too. So a lot of companies will very positively say employees are our most important asset. And I'm like, that's not as good as it could be. That's better than like a lot of ways to value employees, right? But still, why do we take care of an asset? Only so it returns on the investment that we put in it, right? So it kind of limits it a little bit. So I think we could do better than that. So anyway, I propose that whole person workplace values is, again, we care about our employees, not just at the workplace, but we care that they're doing well in their other parts of their lives. And so articulating values, and at a large organization, maybe that has to be a process where we get leadership teams together and things like that to do that. In a small business, a lot of people are mission driven when they start a business, right? Or they started their own business and dropped out of corporate America because they wanted to do things differently or a certain way, right? So that's a little more of a natural fit, as you said. But regardless of where you start with that, what you really need to do is embed your values in what you do. So a lot in workplace wellness and well-being, and even diversity and inclusion, tends to be like add-ons that like human resources is in charge of. And that's not quite good enough, because that's just an add-on. That's an add-on onto other things, and it's not as important, and it can go away. In fact, we're seeing some of that, right? But when it's embedded in what we do, right, then like diversity and inclusion or employee well-being is built into things like, how do we hire people? How do we onboard people? How do we evaluate performance that might allow for more flexibility? How do we redesign work so people aren't overloaded and people can actually take a vacation? Maybe like overlapping team responsibilities and things like that allow someone to be able to not have to be connected to work after hours, right? That's a job design question that could be embedded in how we operate. Again, and then for comp team, like what's our attitude towards pay and total compensation and benefits? And what kind of other vendors, are we providing help with employee assistance programs and other things like that? Those are like formal things that people do or organizations do in terms of how they manage. But what we need to do is think about, how do I make sure these values that I have are enacted in all of these things, so it doesn't become an add-on. A caring for employee well-being becomes part of how we make decisions across all of these areas. So that's the trick. So it's one thing to have the values, and I think a lot of us do, even if they don't quite enact them. It's, how do I really rethink my approach to management and to human resources so that, we embed those values in what we do. And, there's different ways to, again, I mentioned, just, you know, uh, I know a BASF, for example, in their human resources, department. Yeah, there's people who own certain processes, but they make sure to overlap team responsibilities. So again, someone can go on vacation knowing that the process is going to run without them. There are law firms that make sure that they have multiple associates on a client account, so people again can go on vacation, or they don't have to answer the phone at 11 o'clock at night. Someone else can take that responsibility, and that's just building that in a little bit. Now that's just a small example. Things like making, are we paying a livable wage? That's the most important thing we could do, right? To give people like stability and reduce stress. And then, do we allow people to work flexibly? That's another thing. And how are we running a remote workplace? Are we saying everybody's in Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, or do we leave it up to teams to decide? And like there's different ways to approach it, and there's no one right or wrong way to approach it, but we have to think about it consciously and then make the decision that's right for our workplace and our employees.
So once we have a process in place, leadership has decided, hey, we're going to focus on this initiative. We're going to be focusing on the whole person workplace and so forth. How do we know as leaders if we're moving the needle? I mean, how do we measure success here?
Yeah, well, again, larger companies, it's easier to like have formal measures, right? In smaller organizations, you can kind of feel it and interact with people directly. But yeah, I mean, we can, there's a lot of employee pulse surveys that you could do to see about this. You can look at employee engagement scores, things like that. Smart companies build this into how managers are evaluated. They're not just evaluated on goal attainment or the performance of their departments or divisions or teams, but the turnover rate, employee engagement scores within their areas should be tracked. We measure lots of things in business. I think we can add, we can make sure that one of the core things we measure is how this lands on employees. Ultimately, the payoff for a lot of companies, again, I think we should do it for reasons beyond the payoff, but the real payoff is you attract and retain employees from doing this. So, you can brand yourself as an employer when you offer certain things. And then you can keep really good people when you're willing to be flexible with them, where you're willing to meet them where they are, where you're willing to step up for them when they need to. You look at there's a lot of research on, at the first year after a woman gives birth, what turnover rates are depending on the types of leave and other supports that women receive. And it's like night and day. It's like, you have 50-60% turnover rates in some conditions, and you have very, very little turnover in other conditions. So, that's the payoff part of it, but we should care beyond that as well. There's a metaphor I like to use with dealing with some of this. So, I kind of use this metaphorical invisible backpack sometimes as a way to help employers and also my students to think through these issues. Everybody carries stress with them, right? And the response, things are weighing on our minds and stuff like that. So imagine everything that's stressing, that causes us stress or anxiety or responsibility we have, is like in a metaphorical invisible backpack that we carry, and it weighs us down, but it's invisible, so nobody else sees it, right? So a lot of employees have these things that maybe an employer's not seeing, but an employer needs to then listen and then, have empathy for people's situations, and then do what they can to try to maybe relieve some of the weight off of this backpack. So if you have like you hired a bunch of people who just got out of college and they have $60,000 in student loan debt, so they have to live with their parents and they can't like start their lives. Some companies are stepping up and helping people repay their student loans, right? That's removing this weight. For new parents, this might be, if somebody has to come back, has a short leave from parental leave, and they're not quite ready, that you're adding stress to them. If you have longer leaves or gradual returns, you allow more work from home in the short run. That's a way to relieve some of that stress. Maybe you're subsidizing childcare, and other things like that. Maybe you have an EAP that helps people with counseling. That helps with some of that. Part of what I'm dealing with is my in-laws are really not doing well health-wise, and it's stressful. And I'm doing it from a distance, and my wife really is doing more of it. But it's stressful and it's a lot of work. And there are companies and there are EAPs that provide not just counseling and emotional support through this, but also like tangible support about like they will help you fill out the paperwork for hospice care or the Medicare payments to make sure these things are done right. And I'm like, wow, what a relief that would be, right? So things large and small, and small things. So a small business, and this one costs zero money. There was one person I interviewed in the book. They were a working parent, and the company had an all hands meeting every morning at like 8:45 in the morning. And this person had 4 kids, and they had to go to 3 different places in the morning, right, to different schools and daycares and things like that. And this person went to bed every night with a pit in their stomach about the stress of how hard the next morning was going to be to get this is pre-COVID story, but getting everybody up and getting 4 kids like up and ready, right? That's hard enough as it is, but then getting them to different places and then getting to work for this 8:45 meeting, which they were getting to at like 8:53 and were all stressed out and weren't really in it. And so the boss noticed this, and the boss was like, "What's going on?" And this person said, "Here's what's going on." And they're like, "Oh my God, I never wanted to make anyone feel like that. I had no idea. From now on, our all hands meetings are at 10." Right. And that costs no money. That's not, a benefits program or a, whatever else, but that's just, seeing a pain point for an employee saying, all right, I recognize this is what you're dealing with. Let me put some respect on it by supporting you with the change. And, so it could be small things like that. It could be big things, Adidas, when they a new facility in a new city, and this is in Germany, but they built this new facility in a new city, and they were hiring locally, but they also transferred employees from other locations. And it was at the end of the school year when they were like bringing people in. And think about it, you got to relocate your family, and if you have kids, like that can be really disruptive because you have your support network and now you're moving to a place where you don't. They pre-bought all these slots at daycares and summer camps for the families who were getting transferred to the one less thing they had to worry about during this transition time, in addition to the other relocation benefits that lots of companies wind up doing. But that's just thinking ahead, right? So the first example was like reactive. The second example is proactive. What is a pain point that we can anticipate and get ahead of? So I kind of like using those 2 examples because it shows large, small, and it shows zero cost, a decent amount of cost, and reactive and proactive. So you start where you are as an employer, and you could do this within your sphere of influence too. So it doesn't have to just be leadership doing it. It could be individual managers and leaders.
I would love to dive into that a little bit more, because I know our serial entrepreneur that we have here on the forum is starting a new business that it's looking at the aging parents and so forth, and how to deal with that. But my question to kind of frame this is, there's employers, there's those situations where they can relieve pressure to help increase performance of that particular individual for the company and so forth. But there's also that humanistic side of things. Sometimes it doesn't lead to the company's benefit. Sometimes we have an outstanding performer that has done well in the past, but now something happens in their life. They have to take care of their aging father, maybe with dementia or something like this, and this happens. So tell us, Shar, a little bit about this initiative.
Well, yeah. So Scott, the whole time you were talking, you could see I was going, yep, yep, yep. When I was in my traditional HR role, as a director of HR at a major healthcare system, I had over 1,000 employees in my quote book of business, and I actually had the behavioral health department. And I remember when I was trying to work with a department like perhaps there was a suicide or a death in the family or an issue with just needing to take a sabbatical and take care of their family. Very low compassion, very low level of sensitivity expressed by the organization at that time. So, and that I call myself HR with a heart, and that's just who I am. So one of my businesses now is about that. I mean, I think helping employers now, it could be in any type of age level. I mean, it could be the younger population, like you talked about, and trying to get a foothold. I loved your example there. It could be people in their midlives are going through devastating divorces and very life-changing issues, or the trailing spouses. And yeah, it can be the fact that our aging population, mom breaks her hip, and suddenly the family is all at odds, and maybe needs a mediator because, one, they can't afford long-term care or assisted living, and don't really have a network. So I think employers can support that process. Again, a low-cost process, but it instead, so going back to when I was an HR person and those devastating things would happen, I would just simply walk in, because that was, here's your EAP brochure. Did you know that you have an EAP program? But I was not well trained, I guess, or I guess I wasn't prepared for some of those real difficult hardships. But after I left the traditional corporate world, I met a nurse during the bombings. I think it was the bombings that were happening in Las Vegas. I think it was the shootings. I'm sorry, the shootings at the Las Vegas shootings. And I talked to a nurse that worked nights, and it was so traumatizing. Those nurses, you know, just dealing with, I mean, just horrible the things they saw. It's kind of like a war zone. The president's wife at that time, I'm not going to make this political, but the president's wife at that time visited to show compassion, but that president's wife only visited the day people. She didn't visit the night people, the people that really experienced the trauma. So many examples. I could tell you like 100 examples. But I do believe that we really need to explore this, really help HR and talent management strategists and learning and development, and that this entire, I really believe that we need to be more creative and more progressive instead of just handing out EAP brochures. I feel that there's also an aspect of HR is so afraid to get into people's business, either HIPAA, or, you know, oh, that's crossing the border of me understanding their sexuality or lifestyle, the pains in their life. But, you know, I do believe that we really can be creative and be more progressive in our talent management strategies for all the hardships that our employees are facing. And I think that, you know, Sumit and Howard and Sam are real good data people here. Wendy, you are too, I know. But really, we need to substantiate the data that shows the performance impact and how employees are impacted and unable to focus on their jobs, and then help our executive teams truly understand why we need to put together these processes to support employees through hardship. And so I'm very passionate about this topic, as you can see.
Yeah.
So I love everything you're saying, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fantastic. And, you know, I'm reminded of one of the central stories that I use in the book is a company I really love. It's Ryan LLC, which is a financial services firm based out of Dallas. And the leader for a long time was very resistant to a more flexible approach. And even though they were like very high turnover, they were like a really good company in a lot of ways. But they were like one of those, like, we evaluate our people based on how much they work, right? Not necessarily other things. So it became one of those like super competitive workplaces, people working 60, 65-hour weeks every week. It was killer. And they lost a lot of people. But the boss was like, no, this is fine. the chief human resources officer was a friend of mine. She was trying for years to like get a more flexible approach. And then the day it changed was a kind of young up and coming employee that the CEO really liked comes into his office with a tear in her eye and a resignation letter and says, I love my job. I love this company, but I'm starting a family. I don't see how I'm going to be able to make it work here. So I'm finding another job. And he turned to a CEO the later that afternoon and it's like, do it. It turns to the CHRO and said, do it all, do everything you want. I'm behind you. And they transformed back in 2008 to the fully flexible, like, full high trust workplace where they don't track hours worked anymore. They track metrics. And their performance evaluation is better and it allows for flexibility. And then they train teams and leaders on this approach. But again, what they did, they became flexible, but they didn't just like react to this person's problem. They were like, a lot of people must be feeling this. Let's be proactive and be more flexible. And a flexible approach, and we're seeing more of this now, that allows more people to not have to declare what they need the flexibility for, right? They can stay private about those, but they could still then work, get all their work done, and they have to maintain high performance, but they could do it around some of their other life priorities, right?
Right.
So I think time and flexibility really is kind of like, if there's a single intervention that can really be proactively there to help the most amount of people, it's probably where and when work gets done, being flexible on those things. So just
So,
your conversation just kind
well,
of,
no, if I could just do one follow-up comment, I do believe it is this cultural transformation needs to be in part of the entire talent management strategy. And when I did have my own business, I did that. I did explain, hi, we just recruited you. We're aligning your competencies. We're aligning all this to your position. You need to understand that we believe in career mobility and flexibility. So if you are dealing with hardships, like one of my employees' father passed away, another one, I could tell you story after story, but I have to be honest, people don't like HR people. They hate HR. I'm not saying everyone hates HR. But that's why I said I'm Shar from HR with a heart. I want to build trust so that you can talk with me and talk to your leader, frankly, and talk to your executive team and not be afraid. Like when I was pregnant and I was scared to death to tell the president of that grocery distribution center that I was pregnant. I was scared to death. And for that very reason, I quit because I was pregnant and I couldn't even talk to him about it. So anyway, I think it's part of the entire talent management life cycle from
yes.
beginning all the way through to build the
Yep.
proper culture. Right.
Right. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. That's how you embed what you're doing, right? In all of the aspects that flow through talent management. I mean,
Right.
how heartbreaking is that? People have babies all the time.
Right.
It's how we perpetuate the species. This is not like you doing anything wrong, and you couldn't talk to someone about this because you didn't feel like you'd be supported or you'd be looked down on or there'd be negative consequences. I mean, that's toxic. And we need to do the opposite of that, right?
Yeah, well, I do think that my daughter got, I think now she wants to get into HR. And I think it's because she sat in a lot of executive boardroom meetings in my tummy, listening to all the mumbo jumbo. But yeah. So I love what you're saying. And we could probably talk forever. But yeah, so thank you for the opportunity for a few of my comments.
How do you convince organizations of the benefits of doing this? Because a lot of them will say, oh, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the time, the cost. How do you convince them that, in the long run, they will benefit from, treating people as people?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different arguments you can make. So, if you have the data behind things like employee engagement or turnover and things like that, you could point to those, and that's an economic argument. But again, like the example I just gave, it had to get personal for the leader, and then the leader got behind it and really supported it. So, your persuasion technique is going to be different based on where you are, but the other part of your question, which I think, was just one word you put in there, which was long term. A lot of places understand that, yes, in the long term, this would be better if we built this kind of organization, but we have to get to that long term. We have these short term initiatives and things like that. So, I think, it's a different approach to, like, how do you staff your organization? How do you distribute work? How do you make sure there's overlapping responsibilities and things like that aren't like cost heavy, right? If you think about it up front, that's just doing things differently. That then enables you to have a more flexible or compassionate approach without it necessarily, being a cost, right? And that might be easier to start kind of in those types of areas. Whereas, building a big wellness program or these other things like have upfront costs, right? So, depending on where you are, the contours of your organization, there's different ways to kind of start at it, right? I would say also, culture change takes time, right? And it's hard, and you're going to have to be doing these things for a couple of years, maybe, in a large organization before it really becomes what everybody feels and expects, and how decisions are made just somewhat more naturally. So I don't want to minimize the challenges to managers on, churning the ship, right? Small businesses, it can be a little easier to do that. So I hope I kind of answered much of your question. And I know it was a little bit of the cop out of it depends kind of answer, but it depends.
No, it's interesting because there are companies that will move in the direction of, we're going to put in all these programs, but they don't change the basic culture of the organization.
Yes.
Now they're offering all these benefits, but they're still firing people left and right because they didn't smile at me in the morning.
Yeah. So a lot of companies there's pressure on employers to like check certain boxes, right? And to say that we do certain things. And that's why we get policies in name only, and like, oh, look at our bundle of benefits.
Right.
Isn't it wonderful? But we're still like not a particularly supportive place to work, right? That doesn't work. That might get people in the door who then get disillusioned and leave, right? Or it's a bait and switch in some ways. And but I mean, I think particularly, and I don't want to sound cynical here, even more than well-being and wellness, it's when we come to diversity, inclusion, and equity concerns, a lot of companies just wanted to check boxes. Yes, we hired somebody to do this. Yes, we have these employee resource groups. Yes, we made a public statement, but they didn't really change what they look for when they recruit and hire, and how they onboard, and how they develop their culture, and expanding the range of benefits, and these other things that really diversity, inclusion, and equity should be embedded into. So I hear what you're saying. Like there's sometimes a disconnect, and the cynical thing is some companies just want to check a box, and the ones who really want to do it, you got to stick with it for a while, because that's how culture change happens.
Great, thanks.
So I've got a related question around that, especially around the diversity and inclusion aspect. When you talk about the whole self, how do you make leaders and other people realize that the definition of the whole self is not the same mold for all the people around? So personal example, I consider myself a very hands-on dad. And when I was working for a consulting organization, and I'd say, I'm going to be on leave tomorrow because I've got to take my daughter for a vaccination appointment, the standard question would be, where's a mother? Or why do you have to do it? Eventually, when I quit because I wanted to spend more time with family, especially with my daughter, a lot of people came up and said, oh, wow, that's a brave decision. That's a courageous decision. You're such a responsible father. And my question to them was, when a woman decides to make that choice, do you use the same words ever? Do you say, wow, courageous, brilliant? If no, then clearly we don't have the same definitions of the whole self, right?
Yes. So that's a great question. And it brings me back to I said, I now I'm putting my attention to the employer. But back in my looking at my working father's days, we confronted this all the time. You know, dads both get like under, you know, the expectations are different. We get overpraised for things that women just do and never get praised for. But also in the workplace, there, you know, in fact, research shows that there are consequences for men being kind of visibly the more active parent, or the, you know, the more highly involved parent. So it's like these cross-cutting things, right? Like men are dinged for this in one way, and men are overpraised for it in another way, and it's not fair. And the thing is, and it's not fair for women, right? Because the assumption then is like all women have a split priority between work and family, and men should only have their loyalty to work. And if you do anything different than those two things, like that's against the norms, and that gets looked down upon. And so the point of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And sometimes we have to get through some things to get there, is that every individual has the right to be judged and considered as an individual, right? So your priorities, again, should be known by your supervisor, I would think. And maybe, you know, collectively organizations need to be open to a wider array of what does family mean to people? What does, you know, all these other things, right? And so what's right for Samit, you and your family might be different than what's right for some other family, right? So we need to have
Absolutely.
kind of a flexible approach that encounters that. And, you know, so, you know, and just one more thing, because this is a hot button, this is an issue that I have felt for a long time. There used to be, and there's a movement away from this, which is good, that so it used to be just maternity leave, and paternity leave was almost nothing. Some companies wind up having what they say is the primary parent gets 16 weeks and the secondary parent gets like 6 weeks. And I'm like, like that's crazy, right? I mean, anyway, so but that gets to what you're talking about. So I'm sorry if I'm not giving a fully rational answer here, because you've hit a hot button for me. But I think that illustrates that when we talk about individual consideration and we talk about diversity, right, we should really talk about that in an expansive way. We don't just mean race, gender, religion, etc. What we mean is all of the things that make you, to the extent an employer can recognize those things and support you with your priorities, they should try to do so. And you can't do everything, right? But if you start with an orientation of, how do I make the right decision for Sunit? That's the place to start, rather than what Char dealt with, which was, this is how everyone is treated. And if you go outside that box or whatever, that's on you. What you want to have is an orientation that's, how do I do what's best for you? And if, again, that's the orientation and the values you start from, and you try to translate that into action as best you can. I mean, again, it's a workplace, right? So it's not, you know, we're not a social service organization, but to the extent that we can support people with that, we should.
That's
Makes
right.
perfect sense. Thank you. But as a follow-up question, I was also curious to know, how do you advise preventing conversations around workplace discrimination? To give you an example, recently Microsoft in the UK, they saw that they had a lot of Muslim employees who would need to wash their hands and feet before prayers. And obviously, in an office washroom, it can be a difficult process to wash your feet in the sink. And therefore, they created special spaces where you could wash your feet as well. And there were some other employees who rose up in arms saying it's discriminatory because you're making adjustments only for one particular religion and not for the others. And they didn't even have any specific demands as such. They were just annoyed about such stuff. So where do you think, I mean, two parts to the question, where do you advise drawing the line, saying we cannot possibly make every accommodation that you need to help you bring your whole self, and also counsel other people saying you should be a little more inclusive, or we need you to understand this is part of who the other person is, and we will abide by this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like Microsoft did the right thing from my point of view, and I don't see how that negatively impacts other people that they, put something off of the washroom that people can do, this thing to help with their religious observance. Um, you know, so some of this competitive thinking sometimes happens when in general the workplace is not super supportive, and then it's like a competition for resources and support. And I would guess that in workplaces where more people felt like they were heard and they are supported, there's less of this like kind of I can't blank on the word, but that attitude towards like, if somebody else is getting something, that means I'm losing, right? If support is pretty widespread, then most people can say, well, okay, that's the way we're supporting certain people. I get supported in this other way, so therefore I don't really mind that somebody else is getting this other thing. If that makes some sense. If we give all this parental leave to someone, and the rest of the work team is like, yeah, just do the extra work. Of course they're going to resent somebody who takes a long parental leave, right? What we need to do is support the other people as well, and if that's the 22-year-old employee that we're supporting with student loan debt, maybe they're not as resentful that someone goes on leave for a while. Right? You see what I mean? It sounds like the policy they put in place was pretty good, but maybe the culture around their supports for these types of things leaves something to be desired. And again, that's a longer term issue, and that's a hard one. But I guess the other orientation is to say our philosophy on accommodating, for certain things is we're going to try to do what we can, knowing that we maybe can't do that all the time. But I think that's a U.S. employment law would say employers are expected to make a reasonable accommodation around religious issues or lots of other issues. So I'd love to hear what some of the people who were complaining about this really think, because it sounds like they're a little out of bounds.
Right. It's always good to dig in, of course. Well, this is such a great conversation, but we are reaching the top of the hour. So I do want to acknowledge our next week's speaker. We're going to be having Jeff Griffiths is going to be joining us. And we're going to be talking about core competencies across the organization and how those are, we look at those competency development level to go up that organization structure. And what's the leadership approach for that? So in the spirit of our conversation today, anybody that's out there that has questions, please feel free to bring those up with Scott. We have a few more minutes. But Scott, to kick this off, I'd love to hear, what do you think would be a good question for our next week's speaker?
Well, so I'd like to hear how we build maybe cross department or cross-functional skills into this approach, because what you really want at leadership at their top is someone who's well versed in an awful lot of what goes on in the organization. So not just building competencies up each kind of silo of your organizational structure, but how do you make sure people get a good mix of competencies as they move up?
That's a great point. There's competencies that are required for each function in the organization that can be significantly different than the overall core competencies of the company, for sure. Well, thank you, Scott. Jules, do we have any questions or anything like that from our listeners?
No, we just had some, Samia did say that she's loving the information. She's actually working on improving her culture at her company through leadership and development training. So that's all we had, no other actual questions. But if anyone has any last minute ones, now's the time.
So one thing I would love to know, Scott, is are there, for our listeners out there that want to hear more about your concepts, and where can they find your books?
basically anywhere you buy books. Most people do that through like Amazon, but I might put a shout out to like IndieBound or some of these other kind of online retailers that kind of are not the giant monolith organization taking over the world. But wherever you find books, you could go to my website, which is my full name, scottbehson.com, and there's links to everything there. I also have a LinkedIn newsletter that I put out about once a month. I'm pretty easy to find because of my odd spelling of my last name. So find me on LinkedIn, and we can correspond or anything like that. So I also I do some speaking and other kinds of workshops and things like that. And again, I'm involved in this organization called Flex Friendly Certification, which helps employers who are doing the right thing by Flex get recognized for it, and they can brand themselves as a Flex Friendly employer.
Branding is flex friendly. That's great. I love that concept. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for sharing your wisdom here today. I really appreciated the conversation, and I think that our listeners really benefited from everything that you had to share with us. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. And again, I really loved the conversation. Honestly, we could talk all day, right? So
Yes, we could.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. And everybody see you next week on the People Strategy Forum. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.